I need you to sit down for this, because what I'm about to tell you is so absurd, so brazen, so aggressively corrupt that if this were happening in any other country, we would be calling it what it is without hesitation, a full-blown abuse of state power for personal enrichment. The sitting president of the United States is now demanding that the Department of Justice pay him $230 million of taxpayer money because he was investigated for Russia and for taking classified documents to Mar-a-Lago. I'm not exaggerating, I'm not paraphrasing, I'm not using dramatic language to juice this up. That is the story. Let's be extremely clear about what's happening here. Donald Trump is telling the American people that because the federal government investigated him for potential crimes, the American people now owe him $250 million. Not because a jury found misconduct, not because a judge ruled in his favor, not because he proved malice in court, but because he feels entitled to it. Because in his mind, the act of being investigated is itself an injustice against him, not a fundamental pillar of how the rule of law is supposed to function. And honestly, this isn't just stunning, it's revealing, because they are saying the quiet part out loud now. The philosophy has fully surfaced. Any attempt to hold Trump accountable is by definition an attack on the state that must be compensated. Make no mistake, this is not about reimbursement. This is not about legal fees. This is not about damages that were proven in court. This is about turning the Justice Department into a personal ATM for a president who is furious that the law ever applied to him in the first place.
Think about the psychological inversion that has to make sense in someone's head. The government investigates whether you broke the law, and your response is not, I complied, or I fought it in court, or I was exonerated. Your response is, you owe me. Not only do you owe me with their money, with your money, with taxpayer dollars. And here's the part that should make every hair on the back of your neck stand up. Trump is making this demand at the exact moment when the very department that would approve such a payout is now run by people loyal to him, people who previously worked for him, people whose careers depend on his favor, people who would be expected to sign off on transferring public money into the private pocket of the man who put them there. If you are not alarmed by that, you are not paying attention. Because this isn't a loophole. This isn't some obscure statute being tested at the margins. This is a president openly asserting financial control over the justice system in response to being investigated by it. Let that sink in. And they want you to think this is normal. They want you to think this is just another Trump headline you scroll past before getting to the weather. But this isn't just another headline. This is a fundamental inversion of what the Justice Department is supposed to be. It exists to investigate wrongdoing, not to compensate the people being investigated for the emotional inconvenience of potentially facing consequences. This is not grievance. This is extortion, dressed up as entitlement. And the most dangerous part? He's doing it out in the open. No attempt to hide it. No concern about precedent, no fear of backlash, just a cold, naked assumption that the machinery of government exists to serve him personally, and that the American people will pick up the tab.
But wait, because as outrageous as this sounds on its own, it is only the entry point into what comes next. The numbers, the filings, the conflicts, the historical pattern, the way this connects directly to Russia, to Mar-a-Lago, to obstruction, to the long-running strategy of turning accountability into a profit center. And once you see how all of that fits together, this stops being a scandal and starts becoming something far more dangerous. Now let's get surgical, because once you strip away the theatrics and look at the actual filings, the actual quotes, the actual conflicts of interest, what Trump is attempting here is even more brazen than it first appears. Here is the reality they don't want you to see. Trump didn't just wake up one morning and blurt out, "Pay me $230 million. This has been quietly brewing for years through what are called administrative claims, filed under the Federal Tort Claims Act. Two of them, one tied to the Russia investigation, the other tied to the Mar-a-Lago classified documents probe. These claims were filed in 2023 and again in 2024, long before the election, long before he was back in office. He planted the legal tripwires in advance. That matters, because under the FTCA, when someone claims the federal government wrongfully harmed them, they can seek damages. But normally this is for things like car accidents involving government vehicles or medical malpractice at VA hospitals, not for presidents furious that they were investigated for national security crimes, and certainly not to the tune of $230 million. That number is not random. It is designed to be shocking. It is designed to be headline dominating. It is designed to signal power.
And when this story finally broke publicly, Trump didn't deny it, he confirmed it, on camera, in casual conversation. When asked about the claims, he said, and I'm quoting here in substance, that the government probably owes him a lot of money, and that if any money came across his desk, he would make the final decision on what happens to it. Let that sink in. The man demanding the payout is also asserting control over the disposition of the payout. That alone obliterates any pretense that this is about legal reimbursement. That's the quiet part out loud. Now let's talk about what this $230 million is supposedly compensating him for. First, the Russia investigation. The investigation that resulted in dozens of indictments, multiple convictions, and documented verified interference by a hostile foreign power in a U.S. election. Trump's claim is that the mere act of being investigated caused him reputational harm. Not that the investigation was unlawful, not that courts ruled it improper, but that the investigation itself offended him financially. Second, the Mar-a-Lago classified documents investigation, the one where the National Archives begged for months to get sensitive government materials back, the one where Trump's lawyers falsely certified that all classified documents had been returned, the one where the FBI executed a legally approved search warrant and recovered over 100 classified documents from a golf club, bathrooms, storage rooms, ballrooms, offices. Make no mistake, none of this is disputed. These are court-verified facts. And Trump's position is not that the documents were never there. His position is that the government had no right to look for them. Therefore, the government owes him. This is not how the justice system works. You do not get paid because authorities executed a warrant against you based on probable cause. You do not get reimbursed because a grand jury reviewed evidence. You do not get compensated because prosecutors believed there was enough evidence to indict. That is not damages. That is grievance monetization. And here's where the conflict of interest detonates. The very department that would evaluate and potentially approve these claims is now being run by people whose careers are directly tied to Trump. Individuals who previously served as his personal attorneys. Individuals who defended him during these very investigations. Individuals who now occupy the top enforcement positions that would normally be responsible for reviewing whether his claims are legitimate. This is not a hypothetical conflict. This is a real, documented overlap between personal loyalty and institutional authority. The same person who defended Trump against potential criminal exposure now sits in a role that could authorize a 9-figure check to him from the public treasury. If this were happening in another country, we would call it state capture. And the way Trump frames it is even more revealing. He does not describe himself as someone seeking legal redress. He describes himself as someone who is owed, emotionally entitled, financially wronged. He speaks of the U.S. government the way a landlord speaks to a tenant who missed rent. And here's the part that obliterates any remaining doubt about intent. Trump has openly suggested that if he receives this money, he might donate it, or he might use it for projects at the White House. He gives himself discretionary control over whether public money becomes a charitable gesture or a renovation project. This isn't reimbursement. This is a loyalty test for the machinery of the state. Now let's dismantle the legal justification, because this is where the entire scheme collapses under its own weight.
Under the Federal Tort Claims Act, the government can be held liable for certain negligent acts by federal employees, but there are massive limits. You cannot claim damages for discretionary prosecutorial actions. You cannot obtain punitive damages. You generally cannot challenge core law enforcement decisions through this framework. And yet Trump's claims are not seeking modest reimbursement for fees. They are seeking sweeping compensation for the act of being investigated itself. In other words, they're daring the Justice Department to violate its own core legal structure to enrich the president. Legal scholars across the spectrum have already said this. Quietly, carefully, but unmistakably, these claims would almost certainly fail if they were brought by anyone else. The only thing that makes them possible is not law, it is leverage. And that brings us to the key question. What happens to a justice system when the person who controls its leadership is also the person demanding payment from it? Because here's the reality no one inside Trump's circle wants to confront. If the DOJ were to approve even a fraction of this claim, it would establish the most corrosive precedent imaginable, that presidents can retroactively bill the Justice Department for investigating themselves. Think about what that means. Any future president could commit misconduct, block investigations, then later demand millions in damages for the inconvenience of accountability. Law enforcement would no longer be a check on power. It would become a financial liability risk. Prosecutors would have to weigh not just the law, but the possibility that opening a case could cost the government hundreds of millions of dollars down the road. That is how accountability dies without a single law being changed.
And the timing here is not accidental. Trump is making this demand at the exact moment when the criminal cases that once threatened him have been frozen, delayed, appeal-buried, or jurisdictionally entangled. The legal calendar has not just slowed, it has been captured. And now, on top of that, he is attempting to reverse the flow of consequence, from defendant to beneficiary, from target to creditor. They are saying the quiet part out loud. Law enforcement is no longer a safeguard against abuse, it is a negotiating partner. And if you're wondering whether this is being treated as serious corruption inside Congress, yes, it is. Lawmakers have already begun formally requesting documentation on these claims. Who reviewed them? Who communicated with Trump's attorneys? What internal analyses exist about their validity, and whether any pressure has been exerted on DOJ staff to approve them? Because here's the line that cannot be crossed. If a settlement is approved, even partially, it will confirm that a sitting president can financially profit from having been investigated by his own government. And once that line is crossed, the idea of impartial justice becomes a myth. But wait, because this is not an isolated move. This is not a one-off tantrum. This is part of a much larger pattern. And once you see that pattern, the demand for $230 million stops looking like an outburst and starts looking like a business model. And that brings us to the long game. Because once you widen the lens, once you stop looking at this as a single outrageous act and start looking at it as the latest move in a long-running strategy, the $230 million demand stops being shocking and starts being predictable. This is not an aberration. It is the business model. It is the logical endpoint of a political career built on one core principle: turn every form of accountability into personal profit. Make no mistake, this is not Trump discovering a new trick. This is Trump refining an old one.
You've seen this pattern over and over again. He gets investigated, he declares himself the victim, he attacks the legitimacy of the institution doing the investigation, he turns the investigation into a grievance narrative, he fundraises off that grievance, he sues, he delays, he appeals, he demands loyalty. And now, in its most distilled form, he is attempting to monetize the investigation itself directly from the public treasury. This is the evolution of grievance politics into grievance capitalism. Let's just walk through the history, because the receipts are everywhere. After the Access Hollywood tape surfaced, he didn't apologize, he claimed victimhood. After the Mueller investigation began, he didn't defend his conduct on the merits, he branded the investigation a witch hunt and used it as a rallying cry. After the first impeachment, he didn't confront the substance, he used it to extract loyalty and punish dissenters. After the second impeachment for inciting an insurrection, he didn't retreat, he used it to solidify his grip on the party. And every single time, the mechanism was the same: convert legal exposure into political currency. Now, he is simply taking that formula one step further. He is attempting to convert legal exposure into literal cash. And the Mar-a-Lago case is the perfect example of how this strategy operates in practice. Because let's remember how that unfolded. The National Archives spent months quietly asking for classified materials back. Not storming, not raiding, asking, negotiating, playing it by the book. Trump stalled, he slow-walked. He returned some boxes, and inside those boxes were classified documents that should never have left the White House in the first place.
That wasn't prosecutorial overreach. That was evidence of wrongdoing handed back by his own team.
Then came the false certification, a sworn statement that all classified materials had been returned, a statement we now know was inaccurate, because the FBI later found more than 100 additional classified documents on the property, in places with foot traffic, in places with non-cleared individuals, in places with surveillance vulnerabilities, in places foreign nationals had previously attempted to access. That wasn't persecution, that was probable cause. Yet Trump's rhetorical move was not to explain, it was to invert reality. He didn't say, I shouldn't have had those. He didn't say, mistakes were made. He said the government had victimized him by checking whether he broke the law. That inversion is the psychological engine of everything that follows. And once you internalize that inversion, once you accept that being investigated is itself a crime against you, you can justify anything. You can justify retaliation. You can justify purges. You can justify loyalty tests. And now, you can justify financial extraction. The Russia investigation followed the same arc. Multiple campaign associates indicted, guilty pleas, convictions, documented foreign interference, bipartisan Senate confirmation of the interference. And yet Trump's political narrative completely detached from the factual findings. In his world, the existence of any investigation at all became the offense. Not the conduct, not the contacts, not the obstruction, the investigation itself became the crime. That narrative wasn't meant to persuade skeptics, it was meant to condition followers, to reprogram the baseline understanding of accountability, to teach the audience that scrutiny is illegitimate, that oversight is harassment, that evidence is persecution. And once you accept that framework, you're primed to accept the next leap. If investigation equals harm, then harm deserves compensation. This is why the $230 million demand is not random. It is the natural next step in an ideological ecosystem where grievance is treated as property.
And the money itself isn't the only goal here. The demand is also a test of institutional submission. It is Trump placing a bet on how far he can bend the Justice Department without formal resistance. It is a loyalty assay. Who objects? Who resigns? Who signs? Who slow walks? Who leaks? Who stays silent? Because the precedential value is almost more important than the check itself. If the DOJ even seriously entertains this payment, it tells every future administration that enforcement decisions will be evaluated not just in courtrooms, but on balance sheets. It tells investigators that every probe carries a potential future price tag. It tells presidents that legal exposure can be managed not only through courts, but through post hoc financial settlements once power is regained. That is not a justice system. That is an auction. And here is where the historical parallel matters, because every democracy that has slid into managed accountability, selective enforcement, and institutional capture starts with these exact kinds of pressure points. Leaders testing whether oversight bodies will still act independently once those bodies are staffed by personal loyalists. Leaders probing whether the mere threat of consequence still exists when command over personnel is consolidated. This is not new behavior globally. It is just new to see it attempted this overtly in the United States. And notice something else that's crucial. Trump isn't demanding exoneration through evidence. He's demanding payment through leverage. He's not trying to prove that investigators acted unlawfully in court. He's not seeking a judicial finding of misconduct. He's bypassing that entire structure and going straight for administrative extraction using executive influence. That's the real pivot point. Once disputes over law enforcement move from courts into political back channels, the rule of law stops being a rule and starts being a negotiation.
And every step of this plays directly into a broader strategy Trump has used for decades, not just in politics, but in business. Litigation as cudgel, delay as defense, counterclaims as deterrence, financial pressure as intimidation. The same tactics that marked his corporate career are now being deployed at the scale of the federal government. Sue everyone, settle selectively, exhaust opponents, frame losses as injustice, then extract concessions. The presidency is not changing that approach, it's amplifying it. And let's be honest about the messaging environment that makes this possible. Conservative media ecosystems have already begun reframing this demand not as corruption, but as retribution. Not as abuse, but as payback for weaponization. The same people who spent years insisting that government should be smaller, taxes should be lower, spending should be restrained, now have no problem with nearly a $230 million flowing directly into Trump's hands as long as it is framed as vengeance. So now the narrative ecosystem is fully inverted. Oversight becomes deep state sabotage. Accountability becomes political prosecution. And a $230 million payout becomes justice. And here is the most dangerous part of that inversion. Once a population is conditioned to see accountability as oppression, any attempt to enforce the law becomes proof of tyranny. That is the psychological terrain on which authoritarian governance flourishes. You don't have to abolish the courts. You just have to delegitimize them in the public mind and then replace them with personal authority. And Trump is now openly operating in that zone. He is not afraid of consequences anymore. Because in his political universe, consequences are imaginary. Courts can be delayed, judges can be attacked, prosecutors can be purged, records can be buried. And now, through this latest move, even the act of being investigated can be financially reversed after the fact.
This is the strategic endpoint of a long campaign to hollow out institutional resistance. Not with a coup, not with tanks, but with erosion, with normalization, with repetition, with fatigue, with 1,000 outrageous stories until outrage itself is worn down into indifference. And that's why the $230 million matters far beyond the number, because it signals that the next phase is not just escaping accountability, it is profiting from having evaded it. And once that becomes normal, the incentives collapse completely. Future presidents will not merely risk misconduct, they will calculate it. They will weigh the potential profits of grievance against the temporary inconvenience of investigation. They will view the justice system not as a deterrent, but as a staging ground. That is the tipping point. And it brings us to the part that can no longer be treated as abstract, the stakes. Because this is no longer about Trump alone. This is about what kind of system survives him. What happens if this goes unchecked is not theoretical. It is not academic. It is not some civics class abstraction. It is a straight-line projection of incentives. If a president can investigate-proof himself and then retroactively demand payment for the inconvenience of oversight, accountability ceases to exist in any meaningful sense. That's not hyperbole. That's math. Make no mistake about the precedent being set here. If this works, even partially, every future president now has a roadmap. Misconduct becomes a calculated risk. Obstruction becomes a delay tactic. And once power is regained, the investigation itself becomes a revenue stream. This is not the rule of law. This is after-the-fact monetization of power.
That is the end game, and this is where the urgency comes in, because if this moment passes without consequence, if Congress shrugs, if oversight stalls, if the public gets exhausted and tunes out, this becomes the new baseline, not a scandal, a standard operating assumption. Future presidents will know you can push the law, you can test the edges, you can obstruct, you can delay, and if you win politically, you don't just walk free, you get paid. That is a system engineered for corruption. The founders understood this risk. That's why they didn't trust elections alone to restrain a president. That's why they built impeachment. That's why they separated powers. They knew ambition would challenge every boundary they drew. They didn't assume virtue. They planned for abuse. And what we are now watching is whether those safeguards still function. Not on paper, but in reality. Because this is the line where a democracy decides whether law still outranks power. If you are watching this and thinking this can't possibly be allowed to stand, you are right. But rightness is not self-executing. It requires pressure. It requires attention. It requires a public that refuses to let corruption be normalized through repetition. The goal here is not just a payout. The goal is submission. The goal is to establish that even the act of investigation is punishable when directed at the presidency. The goal is to teach the system fear. And once a justice system learns fear, it no longer delivers justice. That's why this moment matters more than the $230 million number. That figure will fade. The precedent will not. So the real question is not whether Trump gets his check. The real question is whether the United States is willing to accept a future in which the law exists at the pleasure of the person it is meant to restrain. Because that future is not loud. It is quiet.
It arrives one extraordinary exception at a time. And once it's fully here, it never announces itself as tyranny. It just calls itself normal.